Chapter 7. When Gonzalo left for Cusco, I should have known then that I was no longer a young man. But at the time, I didn't. I wouldn't know until much later. So back to the jungle we marched. I was in charge of 30 men, all much younger than me. We searched every inch of that jungle. All we thought about was Manco and what he was hiding. The jungle, though, proved to be a difficult trek. I almost forgot how hellish it was. I almost forgot how impossible it felt. But the heat reminded me, and I paid with interest. Ahead were endless vines and enormous trees. We slashed our way through and found many trails that went nowhere. After a while, the streams disappeared, and so did the river. Many nights I kept awake and I listened to my surroundings. Every morning in the jungle was wet and damp. The air felt dense and moist and hot and ungodly, especially when it rained. The jungle's heat started before sunrise, and although Cusco was very hot at the midpoint of the day, it was nothing like the jungle. Words were vague and confusing. We hardly used them. There was no need for them. Instead, we fell into our familiar routine. We spat, we sprawled, we took off our armor, we languished, we put our armor back on. Our movements replaced words. They came in swishes and smacks, then slides and shifts. But the cacophony of the jungle's sounds rang louder. The jungle took our souls. The jungle didn't care. It all felt like a graveyard. Our faces filled with red whelps as flies and spiders and fleas constantly bit us. We itched and scratched ourselves until we bled, but we pressed on and slashed. When it rained, it came down at a drenching pace. It splattered on our helmets and soaked our skin. And when the sun emerged from the clouds, so too came the heat, and the air was suffocating. And for long periods, we didn't breathe. After a week, we were no nearer to Manco. We didn't find any clue of any kind. There was only the jungle. And after another week, it all seemed like a horrible mistake. The men cursed the air. Some cursed at the birds. Small fights broke out amongst them, but I allowed it. The frustration of our marches was enough to make any man lose his mind, and my men frequently did. I didn't blame any of them. Damn fools could have killed themselves for all I cared. It would have been easier for me. One morning I saw about 100 red ants crawl and smother one man's face. He had been sleeping against a rotten log all throughout the night. He managed to get most of the ants off, but the man's face was swollen and grew about 2 sizes larger as the day progressed. The other men made fun of him at first, but at midday, the man collapsed, and 2 days later, he died. No one knew his name. Nevertheless, we gave him a proper Christian burial. More days passed. There was still no sign of the Incas. The fog continued to spiral. We forged through it. But in all that time, we had found nothing, and had encountered even less. I kept the men moving, hoping the jungle would end. But it didn't. The elevation gradually grew higher, and our movement slowed down considerably. Another day passed, and with it came a heavy, dense fog. The men kept looking up, anticipating an ambush, but it didn't come. Then, one afternoon, the inevitable happened. I read it on their faces. There was dissension among the men that we had gone too far into the jungle. Being their leader, I couldn't let them believe in anything but our mission, but I knew these men could not be brought back. They still believed in Cusco. Because unlike the promise of El Dorado, Cusco was real, so they decided to leave. I was fair to them. There were 10 men in all, 1/3 of the entire company. I saw their exhaustion and knew their intentions. I told them to forfeit their attempts and to return back to Cusco. I neither gave them my blessings, nor did I damn them to hell. I just watched them disappear. The dissension still lingered, especially with the men who remained. Some of the men said I went too easy on them. They were right. I could have tried them for treason and hung them before the end of the afternoon. I could have, but I didn't. I knew cruelty only went so far. I had seen the cruel way Gonzalo went about it when he had full control. I had seen that absolute control led to absolute madness, and before I slipped into that trance, I resolved within myself to never rule with such irrational measures. So I let the men go to their own demise. For the men who stayed, they asked me several questions. They asked me several times what was happening in Cusco. I told them in confidence that Cusco would remain secure and peaceful, and that our focus was on finding and killing Manco. I told them that our luck was bound to change, that Manco and El Dorado were close, and I told them to remain vigilant. Many more days and nights had passed, but our bad luck stayed. For 3 straight days, the rain poured down. One night, I saw the pale moon come up before the mountains. The mountains looked different when facing west, and the moon looked much smaller. I dreaded the night and wanted nothing else but to remain blank and void of thought, yet I knew this was utterly unavoidable. My thoughts rushed and lingered, but I thought about Soto most of all. Then a strange thought came to me, but I thought about it anyway. I pondered what my life would be had Soto been my father instead of my friend. I thought of the hell that it would have been. What painful life that would be. What would I have learned? And what position of power would I possess? We were 10 years apart, but it felt very much as if Soto was my contemporary. However, if Soto were my father, I'd be in the same situation Almagro's son would be in. To follow without question, to perform orders, to live in the shadow, much like Christ, much like any son who was obliged to follow his father's footsteps. But at the end of the night, I drew to a swift conclusion. If Soto were my father, I'd simply have to kill him. I awoke and found myself dripping in sweat, but I was relieved. Soto wasn't my father. My father was dead, and I thank God he was. But the second thought never quite left me. Soto was my brother. Yes, that was real and undeniable. He wasn't a brother in the flesh. He was my comrade. And that's probably what I missed the most. He taught me what he knew. He didn't teach me right or wrong. He didn't pontificate. He taught me to look at the board and to see the pieces for what they were, as if looking at the valley from high top a mountain. And the story of our conquest followed very much like the game. I knew my place. I knew I was a pawn. And I knew that the last words Soto said to me were the most important words for my soul. I was my own man. The jungle continued. We spent 2 months going in circles, spotting the same trees. Manco was nowhere in sight, nor was El Dorado. Not a trace, not even a hope of one. More days passed, and one night I heard a queer, faint sound that I thought was whistling. At first I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again. I thought it was a bird at first. I savored every note and fell in love with its melody. It was a moment I'd remember for a long time. It was a moment that I longed to return to. But then the whistling stopped, and the hum of the jungle took over. I reached into my bag and retrieved the gemstone that I had found in Kerimaka. I stared at it for the longest time. I had simply forgotten about it. It was still smooth, and it still glimmered. It seemed so timeless and absolutely stable. And still, I was convinced that it was all worth it. I stared again at my fortune in my tiny little bag. My thoughts subsided, and I felt where I was. I was still in the jungle. I was still alive. So was Manco. We were both hanging on. But the whistling that Sardina heard was not of a bird. It was of a shaman. This time a younger shaman who hailed from the lower end of Vilcabamba. The shaman swung from tree to tree and watched the Spanish languish from afar. He later informed Manco of the news, and Manco led his people further through the jungle. Vilcabamba now seemed old to Manco, but when he gazed upon the mountains, he felt warm and assured. On a cold morning, Manco led his men to a small village. The villagers rushed over in canoes, and later the people gathered and worshipped the rising sun. They shared a unified prayer and cried. They thought all day of those they lost. And at sunset, the sky returned black with stars. The air filled with moans and cries, but then a softening silence followed, and for the Incas, there was nothing more important. Manco looked up to the canopies and studied the wind and the world and everything in it. There was a calm wind, and as the birds flew down from the cliffs and over towards the valley, Manco took it as a sign. Later, he mounted upon a Spanish horse. Then he stopped, dismounted, and continued on foot in stride with his fellow men. As he marched, Manco spoke in constant prayer to his brother Atahualpa. The dream was permanently etched into his mind. He became one with it, and he saw it in all things. And with it, Manco said a simple phrase that he repeated over and over again. We still live in sacred times. And during the night, Wamampoma and Manco discussed the obvious. What now, Manco? We keep defending. Like this? No, not like this. Why not? They'll keep coming. So have we lost Cusco forever? No, we haven't lost Cusco. Cusco is in here. Manco pointed to his heart. They cannot destroy that. What now, Manco? What else? We'll have to make a new Cusco, Wamampoma. For our people. Where, Manco? The gods will tell us. The shamans will show us. We will follow them. Manco pointed over. Wamampoma squinted and shrugged. Manco's finger steadied and did not waver. I can't see it, said Wamampoma. Keep looking up, said Manco. A whole month passed, and the Incas continued on foot and crossed Vilcabamba. Then they came across the bridge. The bridge was massive, and it was woven with the strongest fiber of the land. It was magnificent and meticulously assembled by the Incas of older times. It swayed to and fro in the howling wind. It connected the two lands, and beneath appeared the surging giant river of the Amazon. And as the Incas reached the bridge, they noticed an approaching storm. It was time for Manco to say goodbye to his old homeland. He knew there was no alternative. His world would have to be partitioned. Manco watched all his people cross the bridge. There were about 5,000 of them. He looked at all their faces. They were old and young, dignified and unknown. Some laughed, some cried, but all the faces were hard, and embedded in each face was the imprint of an undying struggle and shared validation. And each imprint was uniquely Incan. These were his people. They would outlive Apachacute. They would be remembered forever. The faces blurred together until there was only a half-dozen left. Manco waited still, and when the last Inca came to the head of the bridge, Manco patted the man on his shoulder and turned his back to the river. Then Manco and his people saw the epiphany. It was clear and bright. The bridge was destroyed. The boundaries between their worlds were now definitive. During the following weeks, it rained without end. When the words finally came to him, Manco made a speech to his people and confirmed his plans of how they would rebuild their world. He stared with earnest, and he said his words. Great Incas, a new Cusco awaits. You know what you must do. The Incas of the past are with us now, and they will be with us always. These evil spirits will die in their own darkness. We will die with the sun in our hearts. Then Manco took a Spanish helmet and raised it above his head to show the crowd. He placed the helmet back down and threw it into the river. So Manco and his people set forth to build their new world. In a week, the Incas marched along the peaks for another set of miles and struggled forward. Then they stopped when they reached a small haven of a place called Vitkos. And it was there Manco confirmed that this would be the location of their new city. He fell to his knees and kissed the ground. A ceremony commenced, and the Incas concentrated the land, honored it, and gathered wood for the night's fire. The land already contained many people, and many deemed that Vitkos was the strongest fortress the Incas had left. It was secure and well established, but most importantly, it was well secluded. So much so that it felt as though the rest of the world had not the faintest idea that it even existed. The next day, Manco entered the square and met with his city planners and engineers. He nodded to all of his people, and with a signal passed, his people went to work. He watched his citizens build new terraces and housing plots. They paved stones for pathways and walls. In the later months, new water and irrigation tunnels were developed to harvest the next season's crop. The city grew and its population doubled, but the Incas did not stop. They kept working, and they kept building. As more time passed, Manco and the Incas heard many stories of the Spanish gods. Apparently, the Spanish only had 3 gods, although some said they only had 1. One story in particular was of their god of wood. The story was about a holy man searching the forest for hearts worthy to follow him. But the god was not a violent god, and many people hated him for that reason alone. The god was strange and welcomed his own death. His eyes were calm, and some had called him a shepherd. But as the story came to fold, it was said that the people were so upset with the god that they hung him on a tree, and in only 3 hours the god had died. Those who believed in the god proclaimed that his spirit remained, and 3 days later the god returned and ruled over ever since. It was the strangest story ever told, but Manco found something in it that he just couldn't put into words. It resonated with him because he saw the god in very much the same light as he saw himself. A month later, the Incas gathered to celebrate the return of their ice god. A ceremony commenced, and night approached. The shaman returned, and the people gathered. More stories about the Spanish gods were told, but the Incas grew bored with these stories. They instead focused on their own gods and their own sacrifices, for they understood these practices to the fullest, and they held them sacred and holy. The shaman initiated the sacred Ikiros and summoned the gods once more. They passed the sacred brew, and the Incas summoned each and every vision. And finally, peace had returned. And for Manco, that peace had been fully revived. When the vision ended, he nodded and came to terms with a new reality. A Pachacute had drawn to its end. And with that, Manco smiled. He knew that his people would survive, and he saw it in all things. We came across a broken bridge. We were all aware that the Incas were close, maybe only a day or so away. But other than the finding of the bridge, our search remained fruitless. Days later, we found ourselves quite lost. More days passed, but there was no sign of Manco anywhere, nor any sign of any Inca. Our chase retarded to a crawl. The bridge might have been a hallucination for all we knew. After a week of such going, I was convinced that it was. I tried my best to discipline the men. There were only 20 of them, but they were a handful, and I was starting to gather disdain for all of them. They were very distracted and entrenched in thought. They were probably thinking about what was happening in Cusco. I yelled at them several times to focus on the jungle, to be vigilant and aware that Manco could be hiding anywhere. But more times than not, boredom had completely overwhelmed them. Periodically, scouts on patrol had joined our group. They monitored our progress and reported back to Gonzalo. They told us what was happening in Cusco, and the stories and rumors ran rampant once again. I trusted the young scouts because they were always in a rush and had no time to fabricate nonsense. They told us everything they knew, and by firelight, the stories intensified. We listened and dug at the dirt with sticks. Then another set of rumors flooded our ears. They flourished, and like mushrooms, they suddenly appeared from the wet, dank ground and bolted up to the surface. One of the main things that all the stories confirmed was that Almagro had returned to Cusco earlier than expected. The stories also confirmed that Almagro had arrested both Hernando and Gonzalo, put them into dungeons, and left them there to die and rot. This rumor seemed to be as true as any rumor presented, and it was confirmed many times. As I recalled, the rumor also was that Almagro and his son returned from a disastrous search for El Dorado and took control of Cusco, beating Hernando out of power before doing the same to Gonzalo. And with Francisco in Lima, and with no other combatants to contend with, the Almagros took complete control of the city and its territories. For how long they held the city, no one could say. Later, rumors of Almagro's state of mind and illness were passed. Some claimed that Almagro had gone completely mad, making decisions no rational man would ever dream of making, and had voluntarily released the Pizarro brothers. Others said that the pressure from the crown made him do it. Others simply said that the brothers escaped by their own measure. But what all the rumors had confirmed was that Almagro was in complete control of the city, and the Pizarros were still alive. There would be one final battle for Cusco. Winner take all, seemingly forever. But the rumors were too much for me. I grew tired of them. I refused to listen or eavesdrop on any conversation, and I ordered my men to leave me alone. I set up the board. Every piece represented a clear resemblance and mirrored the chain of events. I stared and tried my best to make sense of it all. I did this because I saw Soto had done this many times. It quelled him, and I thought it would quell me. I went through all the possible moves, and I watched piece after piece fall until the entire board was empty. And such were kingdoms. It was inevitable. What pieces remained would be participants of the endgame. Certainly, there would only be a few, if any at all. What pieces would they be? And what king would prevail? White or black? Black or white? Knights would take rooks. Pawns would take bishops. The center was Cusco, but no side had an advantage. It was all too complicated. It was a constant war, with no foreseeable end. It was a balanced trade of bloodshed, and nothing else. I became very drowsy. My mouth was dry, and my beard was smeared with dirt. I fretted and lay on the ground. I grew dumb with each passing moment, for the realization was clear, hard, and true. I was no longer a participant. I realized who I was. I was the pawn on the far end of the board that had no relevance. And it wasn't until then that I knew why Soto had left as I recalled his words. "You're watching a disaster, Sardina." But for the Incas, their king was very much alive. And I must admit, although our main mission was to capture and kill Manco, there were times I hardly thought about him. But later it dawned on me. Then it fell on me. The fact was simple and all too true. All the bloodshed, all the rancid, heinous, vile hell was likely all my damn fault. Had I killed Manco when I had the chance, this never would have happened. I hadn't thought about that moment for a very long time. It was as if I forgot about it, suppressed it, and kept it hidden. But it came back and took hold, and it was all that I could think about. But now the memory was back, and I could see it manifested in all things. I could hear the pangs of metal shoot through the walls of Cusco. I could see Manco's painful face through the fallen rain. The guilt was strong and overwhelming, and the damning memory replayed over and over again in my mind. If I confessed this to a priest, he would have killed me. Had I confessed this to Soto, I don't know what he would have done. I thought of that second many times. The second where I could have ended it all. I had killed many men before him. I hadn't hesitated then. If I only just inched my sword closer. If only I called out the men to head Manco off. If only. But in truth, it was only a thought. I was not solely responsible for all of this. Having not killed Manco when I had the opportunity only meant a slight variation. And the more I thought about it, the more I knew that the rivalry between the Almagros and Pizarros was inevitable. And it would lead to a perpetual war, even if Manco were dead. Almagro still would have to return to Cusco, with or without Manco. And indeed, with Manco away, it only made things easier. But still, I felt the guilt. Then I stared deeper. I noticed that odd, stupid little pawn on the edge of the board was still there, as was I. And when I stared at it, I stared at myself. I forced myself to smile like a good, stupid pawn. A pawn that did not fully comprehend power. But unlike most pawns, this pawn was paid. He was paid to do a monumental task. To simply kill a king. I adjusted the board. All that was left were pawns and kings. And for once it made sense. This was my redemption. To finish. To lay the Inca king to rest. But I could only stare for so long. I fell asleep. And as I dreamt, I saw both Soto and Francisco talking amongst themselves. Both men looked peaceful and rested. No doubt Francisco had already known the entirety of the situation. No doubt Soto probably knew as well. All of Spain would have known it by then. I imagined Francisco speaking with Soto about these matters. He was probably doing so at the very moment. I awoke in the dark. I wiped the sweat off my face and looked around. The men were asleep, and the fires were dying. And as I sat down, I stared at the sky and thought about all the fallen pieces. In reality, Sardina's dream wasn't too far off, for on a common afternoon near the shores of Lima, Francisco and Soto did exactly what the dream had painted. They shared their thoughts. It was their final conversation, and Soto's last favor. Soto concentrated his eyes on the ocean. In truth, he was waiting for his ship to arrive. Francisco watched the clouds scatter from the south to east. They discussed what pieces to keep and what moves needed to be made. Soto chose his words carefully, and Francisco took note. "So you would put Alvarado in charge," said Francisco. "I would," said Soto. "But don't you think they have too much cavalry?" "Yes, Almagro's cavalry is considerable, but we have cannons and foot soldiers. That's a clear advantage. This is quite an opportunity you have, sir." "I'm worried it's just a trap." "I don't see it as a trap. Almagro held your brothers captive and did not capitalize on it. That mistake is Almagro's, and his alone. Now your brothers are free, and that's why you have to strike now." "This is a gorgeous opportunity," said Francisco. "No, it's only an opportunity. I'm afraid that's all it is. In either case, Almagro is a fool. You can't let him get away with it. And if you don't take advantage of this, you'll be an even bigger fool, sir. History never forgets." Soto stared at his fortune, 5 caravans in all. It was all still there. He was already one of the richest men in all the world. He was merely waiting for his ship to arrive. Back to Spain. Back to the old world. He was merely biding his time. "So why are you leaving, Soto?" "I have my reasons. Spain is safe for one." "That it is. But I can't fight any more of your wars, sir. I can only fight my own." "Your own wars," Francisco said. "Yes, sir." "Well, Soto, I hope to see them someday." Soto stared at the sea again. It was still empty, and he waited another day. And with that, the favor was met, and all were left to see what would happen to Cusco. Coronado yawned. My throat had gotten dry. I drank what was left in my chalice, but it wasn't much. I knew that my story was starting to bore him. I was close to the end and wanted to finish it, but I could tell Coronado was losing his patience. He wanted the intimate. He wanted the climax. He wanted to hear about Cusco. I couldn't blame him. But it wasn't my story. I wasn't part of it. But Coronado wanted to hear it nonetheless. So what happened to Cusco? I wasn't there, Coronado. I was in the jungle. But you must have heard. All I know is what I imagined. Coronado pressed his fingers upon his lips. Then he interjected. So the burden was the very thing they fought for, he said. What burden? Cusco. Why do you say it was a burden? What else would you call it? Cusco was the prime reason for all that occurred, was it not? With all that power, with all those characters, Cusco had to be fought after. It seemed inevitable. Don't you think so? I didn't answer. I couldn't tell what he was driving at. Then again, I was very tired, and the wine was very strong. I could tell from his squirming that he wanted to know exactly what happened in Cusco, blow by blow. But I simply wasn't there. I wondered what version of the story Coronado had heard. Did he hear it from a Pizarro supporter or from an Almagro loyalist? Perhaps the story Coronado had heard was from someone indifferent to the families. Perhaps he heard the stories from a priest or from someone who merely heard it from someone else. Whatever the case, Coronado needed it to be repeated to him. He needed validation, but I couldn't give it to him. In the end, there were only two stories, two sides. The Almagros fought for what was theirs, as did the Pizarros. My story really didn't matter to Coronado. For what happened in Cusco was only what I heard, but what I heard, I still cannot believe. And in Cusco, as on the board, all the pieces had been assembled. The rumors held true. The Almagros returned from their disastrous campaign, and without hesitation they took over the entire city. In sprinting fashion, the Almagros came back to Cusco, just like they came back to Carimaca, angry and poor. With obscene momentum, the Almagros took over Cusco in less than an hour. Almagro then arrested both Hernando and Gonzalo, and afterward both brothers were imprisoned and sent to a cold dungeon located below the temples. The Almagros held court and ransacked the Pizarro side of the city. In the evening, they dined at their favorite table. They feasted on roasted pig and ripe pears, and they drank and finished the wine that they had found hidden in the Pizarro's lower chambers. Drunkenly, the Almagros ascended to the steps of the tower, digested their meal, and looked down at the sprawling city. For the moment, they were glad, but they were not delighted. In the back of their minds, all they could think about was their next move. With the Pizarro brothers ransomed, communication with Francisco was the next logical step, but the Almagros were too tired. They spent too long of a time in the desert, and they knew it would probably take the rest of their lives to fully recover. With a look of sheer confidence and pride, Almagro handed Diego his sword and patted him on the shoulder. He knew that his son had understood. It was their city now, and it was their obligation to defend it. More days had passed, but the inevitable question of what to do with the brothers still went unanswered. The Almagros initiated their own productive procrastination upon the matter and focused more on the important things. Almagro's men cleaned up the city and disposed of the dead bodies and slaves and dead Pizarro loyalists. The smoke and debris hovered in the air, and the smoldering ashes still surrounded most of the city. Then the slaves and treasurers went to work, and transported all the gold across the boundary lines until there wasn't even a smidget of gold left in the Pizarro quarters. As the treasurers made their calculations, Almagro ordered that all of his men were to be paid a sufficient bonus for their efforts and their loyalty. The bonus was quite a hefty sum. It was psychological redemption for his men and validation of Almagro's respect for them. Even before this occurrence, Almagro's men took him very much like a father, and they knew that another battle was likely going to happen. Almagro himself remained quite reticent and kept to himself most days. His mind was torn in complete ambiguity. Then later, sheer ambivalence. Then much later, pure apathy. He prayed, he swore, he ate, he drank, he vomited, he pissed, he defecated. He kissed his chalice, but mostly, he drank. As for the imprisoned Pizarros, they were kept alive indefinitely in their dungeons. Almagro refused to pay either Gonzalo or Hernando a visit, and left that detail to his son Diego. Each morning, Diego delivered both the brothers their meal, which was always a raw slab of llama's liver and a whole dead rat. It was a great pleasure for Diego to watch the Pizarros feast through his view from the iron bars, but he never said a word to either of them. He merely stared and spat at them. The celebration lingered, but Almagro's great discipline and vigilance started to wane. The distinct decorum of the Almagros evaporated, and soon the city lay in absolute filth, with excrement and rotted food scattered everywhere. On many days, Almagro sauntered through the city with a sword in one hand and a chalice in the other. He slurred his words, struck any Inca woman he pleased, and had his way with them. During one night, he challenged his men to a duel. None took to his offer at first, but as the wine settled down, 3 men approached and challenged him. The fighting ensued, and Almagro started by kicking the first man in the groin. For the second man, he simply cut off his fingers. And for the third man, Almagro took a brick and bashed it over the man's head. Needless to say, after this instance, there were no other challengers. When it was all over, some asked why he did this, and the general answer was that this was Almagro's cordial sign of camaraderie and stewardship towards his men. It was a delightful surprise to many of Almagro's men to see him behave in such debauchery, but in truth, many knew Almagro lost his sanity well before they recaptured Cusco. Some said that this was Almagro's compensation for struggling in the desert as long as he did. Others touted that Almagro was just an old man who knew he was going to die. But whatever was the case, the drunken days and nights continued. They went on and lingered and grew more strange and sad. Almagro proclaimed that the entire month was to be a month of jubilation. Masses were canceled and sobriety was outlawed. There was no time for guilt. Relaxation was the mandate, and the freedom to be a damn fool was permitted and encouraged. Almagro's men knew that their reality would sink in eventually. They knew that they would recover and sober up, but now wasn't the time. Now was the time to celebrate. In the words of Almagro himself, these exploits were earned and justified. One day, Almagro killed a stubborn Inca slave by slicing his limbs with his sword. Then he took his chalice, cupped the dripping fresh blood, and drank the blood with a splendid burst of satisfaction. When asked why he did such a thing, Almagro's response was that he was simply trying to recapture his youth. Some men laughed. Others merely gave blank stares and shrugged their shoulders. When Almagro was bored, he counted his money. He lay on top of a heap of gold, swam in it, and on one occurrence he slept on the pile for an entire afternoon. He didn't talk to many, and he carried on, drinking liberally with a disgusted red face. And to those who prayed, Almagro put a foot up their rears and shouted, "Your liberties are secured! They're well secured, you dishonest sons of bitches! Stop groveling!" The most unhappy man drank more and more, and Almagro continued to steal the hearts of his men, but his face was still marred with pain. One night, Almagro stabbed a horse in its face. He smiled greatly when he did so. Then he screamed at the dead horse and shouted, "This is my city, goddammit! This is my son's city! This is the city's city! You dare to oppose? Come forward then, you bastards! Come forward!" But like most drunks, the memory of the present eluded the Almagros, and the harsh reality inevitably caught up with them in the worst way possible. And on one fine day, when Diego went to serve the bastard brothers' meal, he found their cells completely empty. Diego also found 4 guards dead on the floor. Immediately, he reported the escape to his father, but Almagro was neither shocked nor appalled, and he refused to say a word. Had a deal been made with Francisco? Had the brothers escaped by their own volition? Or had they gotten help from others? Almagro wouldn't tell. He readied his sword and sharpened his blade with careful strokes. Then he looked at Diego and handed the sword over to him. Almagro then climbed up the balcony, gazed at his beloved Cusco, then looked east, and waved his hands in a come-hither motion. Not too much time had passed, and in an undisclosed location, Hernando Pizarro commanded his troops in preparation to take back Cusco. Along with him was Gonzalo and Alvarado, a man of considerable reputation and military skill. The 3 men came together and delved into their plans. They schemed for days and formulated strategic tactics of how the battle would go down. They talked about flanks and decoys. They talked about cavalry entry points. They talked about the cannons and where to rendezvous once they took over the city. And they talked about what would happen next if they were to retreat. And when they grew tired of strategy, they talked about their misgivings, and again about their general disbelief that they were still alive. The Pizarros, in particular, talked about Almagro, and wondered again and again of the ease of their escape. It was as if Almagro wanted such a challenge. It was as if Almagro wanted to prove more. It was as if Almagro wanted all the world to know about his victory. Almagro still believed in the sense of fair play, even in his drunkenness. Releasing the captured Pizarros meant that the crown would deem him a worthier patriarch. Yet the unyielding fact remained, and in the end, it was Almagro's downfall. He forgot about the blind and obvious. He forgot that he was dealing with the Pizarros. And on the bright sunny day, he got his wish. One morning, Almagro smelled the fires of the Pizarro company. He refused to eat or drink and fasted the entire day. His eyes were red and stained, and his face remained wrinkled and gray. He clenched onto a broken arrow spear and grasped it with his knuckles until he bled. Then he watched his army gather. He spoke calmly and gave out his orders to Diego, who then repeated the orders to the assembling horsemen. On the other side of the city, 3 miles away, Hernando, Gonzalo, and Alvarado went over their final assessments, shared a bottle of wine, and said a final prayer. Paying homage to their brother Francisco, Hernando and Gonzalo made a line in the dirt with the heels of their feet. They stared at the line for the longest time. Then they nodded to each other, crossed the line, and pointed their swords east towards Cusco. About 3 miles south was a place called Solanas. It was a vat in pitted territory with low-level ground and a giant marsh, and it proved to be the main focus of the battle. At noon, the armies assembled and took the field. Drums rolled, trumpets blared. And with the first strike from Hernando's cannons, the battle began. The two armies charged at one another at a blistering pace, and blood spilled from one end of the field to the other. The cannons roared. Blast after blast shook the ground, and swords, horses, and men piled on top of each other. A rain of fire came from the arquebuses. They were then followed by crossbowmen, and later the heavy cannons. Shards and balls of fire sailed in streams, and the ground burned in shattered flames. Then the infantry charged at each other with a resounding blitz of rage, and it was clear that Almagro's men had the advantage. Almagro's men pinned the Pizarro advance and stopped them from resurfacing, but the Pizarros recalibrated. The army paced and trotted. Again, the timeless sounds of clangs and pings of clashing armor rang out in succession, and again they were followed by the sounds of cuts and slashes. "Santiago! Santiago!" Decapitated heads of both horses and men rolled on along the salty sand, and the land resembled a field of rotted cabbage. All in Cusco watched the battle from afar, but there was no indication of what army was winning. No quarter was given that day from either side. Those who tried to surrender and beg for their mercy were gutted along their stomachs, and the wounded that wept for care were at first discarded, then promptly executed. Almagro himself led a series of charges along the perimeter and defended his position beside the Inca slopes. Although out of breath and certainly in great pain, Almagro could be heard on high, shouting and repeating, "This is not your land, Pizarros!" And Diego followed the song in harmony. But as an hour passed, the truth of the matter prevailed. Almagro's army was simply outnumbered. Victory soon became an impossibility. His men were surrounded. And in the swirl of smoke, bodies, and charging horses, the Almagro army dwindled to less than half. Soon the air was filled with smoke. Fog hovered in white plumes of fallen ash. Then Almagro led a final charge, but to his horror, the charge achieved absolutely nothing. He looked behind him. Nearly all of his men lay dead on the ground. The Pizarro's army took over Cusco's gates, and half an hour later, they surrounded every inch of the city. In the smoke, many of Almagro's men retreated. The Pizarros sent out a quarter of their army and chased after them, and the surviving soldiers slashed away in the trail of smoke and ash. Another dark plume of smoke emerged from the distance, and many of the Pizarro soldiers came to see Diego and others dash and escape towards the jungle. The final hour elapsed. Cusco was now completely under siege by the Pizarros, and the battle was officially over. Smoke billowed, and the cannons ceased fire. Dusk had settled, and the last of Almagro's men surrendered. The fires arose with the scent of burning flesh, and the bells of Cusco chimed. The monks gathered in march with lanterns and incense. They blessed body after body, and they hammered cross after cross into the ground. The next day, the prisoners were issued thwart. There were 20 prisoners in all, and Almagro was the very last one. He was paraded back to Cusco in chains, and the crowd shouted and spat at him. He looked gray and dead. He was tied by his hands and pushed to the head of the line, and every inch of Almagro's soul seemed broken. Hernando ordered his men to move Almagro into the same dungeon that he put him and his brother in not so long ago. The Pizarros ransacked the city once more and took back their gold. The cruel twist of fate was warming and welcoming to the Pizarros. But unlike their predecessor, Hernando and Gonzalo met Almagro several times in the dungeon. Words were exchanged, and swears were shouted. Self-possessed and enraged, Almagro screamed so much he could be heard from the temple steps. He pleaded, asking what happened to his boy Diego, but no one answered him, because in truth, no one knew. A week had passed. Almagro could no longer scream. Convinced that his food was poisoned, Almagro refused to eat and became very weak. Enraged by this, Hernando requested a servant to enter the dungeon and serve Almagro a plate of gold instead of food. As Gonzalo put it, he was merely given to Caesar what was Caesar's. But as the hierarchy of the crown heard of this, Hernando immediately stopped the gesture. Gonzalo, however, upheld the orders and went out of his way to do the feeding himself. It was an intoxicating ritual, and each day, and with great pleasure, Gonzalo went down into the dungeon with a plate filled with gold and proceeded to throw it at Almagro's head. When he got close enough, he reached his arms through the bars and slapped Almagro across the face. But Almagro gave neither resistance nor retaliation. He was simply too weak. In the back of Gonzalo's mind, torturing Almagro was merely practice, and he imagined how he would torture Manco had he found him. He knew that he would eventually return to the jungle to continue his hunt for Manco. But for the time being, Gonzalo remained in Cusco. His family needed him, and their business still remained unfinished. With each visit, Gonzalo gave Almagro new threats, taunts, and casts of aspersions. But still, Almagro failed to utter a word. And with each visit, Gonzalo drank an entire bottle of wine and urinated upon Almagro's iron bars. "So how was El Dorado, Almagro?" said Gonzalo. Was it golden?" "Don't ever dare to dream, Almagro. It's not worth it." The gold in the cell continued to pile, and Gonzalo continued his thoughts. "I just thought of a great idea, Almagro, just now. Maybe we should put all this gold to good use and shove it up your ass. Perhaps it will make diamonds someday. Seems like a good investment to me. What do you think?" "Well, we all have all the time in the world, you know. We'll split the royalties with your son, of course. Well, that's of course if he's alive." One would think such torture would only last so long, even for the torturer. One would think. But Gonzalo did this ritual for 30 straight days, and each day he grew more and more satisfied, with perverse enjoyment. On a bright day in June, Francisco returned to Cusco, and upon his arrival his brothers and the members of the Royal Assembly of Spain had greeted him. He was informed of all the events beforehand from scouts and close allies, and at dusk he approached the court with esteem. Then he went into the dungeon to visit his longtime friend. When he got there, though, Francisco was appalled. Almagro looked very dead. But upon further examination, he wasn't dead, which made matters even sadder. In terms of legality, Hernando issued several documents of Almagro's crimes to the Assembly and managed several signatures from main dignitaries for a general trial. Those who opposed the execution constantly delayed the trial, and they mostly consisted of Almagro's close friends and allies. During the deliberation, some pointed out the unfairness of the imprisonment of Gonzalo and Hernando. In vote after vote, there were more dissenters, and day after day Almagro's apologists vocalized their opinions. But oddly, days later, about a dozen of those individuals found themselves poisoned and deathly sick. As the trial continued, it seemed almost certain that Almagro would be executed. After 2 more trials and hours of deliberation, he was found guilty. And when it was official, the signatures were finally penned. Almagro was indicted on several counts, but the most damning count was the indictment of war against the crown, which penalty summoned instant death. The counts were as followed: guilty of levying war against the crown and thereby causing the death of many of His Majesty's subjects, guilty of entering into conspiracy with the Inca, and finally, guilty of dispossessing the royal governor of the city of Cusco. And on those charges, Almagro was condemned to suffer death as a traitor, and was summoned to be publicly beheaded in front of the great square of the city. And on the 8th of July, 1538, Almagro's day of execution finally came to pass. The square was filled with personnel of the like, dignitaries and elder statesmen, Inca slaves, and appointed leaders all gathered into the square. Several armed guards surrounded the plaza, doubling over in staggered formation across the houses and temple complexes. The crowd continued to gather, but the longer they waited, the more they knew something wasn't right. There were no participants anywhere in sight, and the crowd grew demonstrably restless and angry. Then news had broken that there was to be no grand spectacle to be shown that day. By orders of Hernando Pizarro, the execution was to be privately held inside the dungeon. In the dungeon, all the Pizarros gathered inside Almagro's cell. The smell was awful, and the dungeon was dimly lit with sparse torches along the cold gray stone walls. The Pizarros waited and whispered their prayers, and the priest blessed Almagro with the sacraments of confession and last rites. At noon, 4 guards escorted Almagro and brought him out from his cell and into the corridor. They unchained him, stripped him of his rags, and dressed him in a fresh white shirt. They strapped his hands once again with iron chains and forced him to his knees. Then the executioner entered. He wore a black hood and a gold cross necklace. He made his way over, escorted Almagro, and laid his head on a slab of stone. Then the unhappy man spoke his last words. He screamed and slurred, and he spat and pointed. "Bastards! Bastards! All you Pizarros! I'll see you all in hell! No matter how hard you think, no matter how much you've forgotten, the truth is clear as God. You're a fraud, Francisco, as are all your brothers. The truth is this city, my city. You found it with my men. You found it riding my horses. This is my city, my son's city, not yours, not your brother's." "So why did you leave it?" said Francisco. Francisco's response went unanswered. Then Francisco unleashed his sword and unsheathed it. "You'll still be in my prayers, Almagro," he said. Then Francisco turned his back and walked away. "Pizarros! May you burn in hell! All of you!" And a second later, the executioner raised his axe, and Almagro screamed his last. With a heavy thud, Almagro's head dropped down and rolled on the floor. The blood dripped and sprayed all over and formed a deep and muddy pool. The witnesses proceeded to leave the dungeon with heavy sighs and sullen faces, and the only souls who remained were the priest, the executioner, the undertakers, and Gonzalo. Later in the afternoon, Almagro's corpse was transferred to the great square of the city, but then it was immediately removed. His remains were auctioned off and came into the possession of his old friend Hernan Ponce de Leon. The next day, Almagro was laid to rest in the solemn church of Our Lady of Mercy, where the Pizarros appeared among the principal mourners. After the funeral, the Pizarros moved to the court area of the square and held a private meeting. And for the entire evening, they shared each other's company. They dined and ate a meal, and it felt very much like old times. Francisco at the head of the table, and Gonzalo and Hernando by his side. Afterward, Ariana and a few other trusted men were also present. When all were assembled, the brothers made one final gesture. They left an empty chair and lit a candle in memory of their brother Juan. And by then, all knew that this would be the Pizarro's last meal in Cusco. Members of the crown's dignitary watched on as the brothers consulted one another. But as Francisco requested, no others were invited to the table. Some dignitaries had sympathetic eyes. Others glared at the Pizarros with utmost disgust. Words were exchanged, but only of the obvious matter, mostly regarding the rule of the lands and taxations of newfound governorships. But all kept a wide eye and wondered about the Pizarros and what moves they would make. Through the course of their meal, the Pizarros talked about Spain and their past. There was little mention of Almagro and his son. They prayed for guidance and discussed what would happen to the city once everything was settled. They settled that Hernando would still be in charge of Cusco and its surrounding hamlets. They also settled that Gonzalo would continue his search in the jungle for Manco. And for Francisco, the brothers all agreed that it would be best for him to depart in the morning and return back to his beloved Lima. For their appetizer, they ate fried bananas and aguajes. They shared bottle after bottle of Almagro's wine and winced. Then Francisco talked about Spain in a regretful, spiteful tone. He raised his glass and said his words. "This is home, brothers. If you wish to go back to Spain, I will not prevent you to do so. As for myself, I would not go back, even in the coffin." Francisco drank more wine. He wanted to say more, but he decided not to. Instead, he settled in his chair and rested. He was aware that there were most likely spies lingering in the darkness, and he told his brothers to choose their words carefully. Then the servants returned to the table, and finally the courses had arrived. A dozen plates of roasted lamb and artichokes were presented, along with smoked fish, and then, finally, the main course, a stuffed pig that was seared for 2 days underneath palms and glazed papaya. Hernando smacked his lips and savored, and Gonzalo tore through his portion and requested more. For the rest of the night, the brothers ate and drank and wrapped themselves in reverie. They knew that they were finally kings, and they savored every moment. Throughout the meal, the Pizarros refused to discuss any other matters regarding the hypothetical, especially the obvious. The obvious was too painful, too complex, and daunting. The Pizarros ignored discussing any of it. The obvious was the state of Almagro's son Diego. Had he died, it would have been a moot point. Yet had he survived, a whole heap of tumultuous trouble and complication would certainly follow. The other obvious subject was the news of Almagro's death spreading throughout the New World and Old. It would only be a matter of time for the crown to appeal a ruling and hold a possible trial for Hernando, and it would also be only a matter of time before the crowd would meddle in each of their affairs. Because of Almagro's execution, the Pizarros knew that they would have to be even more vigilant and careful of whom they spoke to. Conspirators and revenge would certainly be inevitable, and the rest of their lives would be dictated by fear. They knew all of these things. They knew of all the hypotheticals, but the Pizarros refused to discuss any of them. The meal was more important. The next morning, the Pizarros shared a final embrace and disbanded once again. And as promised, Francisco went back to Lima, Hernando took back his helm in Cusco, and Gonzalo returned to the jungle in search for Manco and El Dorado. There would be more stories, of course, but in the end, that was Cusco. And for the Pizarros, they were terribly aware of what horrible things were to come. So they prepared, departed, and went their own way. And in their memories, each brother recalled to themselves the image of that meal, and they thought long and hard upon why it was so important. The reason remained the same. It was the Cusco they wanted to remember. Coronado remained unsatisfied. Too many questions went unanswered. He couldn't help but ask again. So what of Diego? Is he still alive? I wish I knew. It appears no one knows. I can't tell if that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's the Pizarro's business. It's not mine anymore. And what of Almagro? Some say he was decapitated. Others said he was garroted. Which was it? I don't know. Forgive me, Sardina. I don't mean to pry. But what happened to him? What happened to Manco Inca? Manco. I knew I couldn't tell Coronado the whole truth. The truth was certainly not one he could comprehend or even fathom. The truth? I refused to delve into it, for I myself did not understand it. I left the truth discarded like my dreams. The truth was in the jungle. It was hidden and secure with Manco and his people. It was pristine and likely never to be heard or seen again. The truth was in Manco's eyes. That's all I'll know for sure. No, I told Coronado what I thought he would buy. It seemed all he could afford. We didn't find him. We didn't find Manco. At first he was appalled at the answer. He winced and turned his head, but I assured him with a firm nod. How long did you search? Many months. It might have been a year. A year? It might have been. It felt like it. I knew my story had run its course. This one anyway. We shared another jug of wine and talked about each other's memories of Spain and horses and women. But my mind remained unsettled. We were relaxed and quite drunk. Then I noticed that Coronado had grinned uncontrollably. He slurred his words, and his ears and face turned bright red. It upset me. I tried not to look at his face, and I stared at the flame and watched it flicker. The room felt much warmer. There was a great silence, and we met it with great respect. Although my body was at complete ease in Coronado's company, my mind was not. My mind went back into the jungle. I heard the birds again. The horrendous hums of the insects returned, and I felt them bite my hands. I saw the river roll and scuttle. I felt it turn, and I felt the wind cut my face. I felt Manco's stare, that long, primal stare of my nightmares. And back I went. We found the river. We slashed through the vines and kept moving through the swamps. We toiled and trekked for miles on end. Then we found clay pots and bone necklaces. Many of our guides confirmed that they had seen several Incas in canoes pass through the sharp bending rocks and the densest part of the canopy. So we headed north. We saw more of the river. Momentarily, I was pulled back. It was enormous. It didn't feel real at first. Again, I drifted, and the tide pulled me in. The river surged and purged and stirred. Then it became calm. I thought of Cora, Manco's wife. It was near the river that I saw her last. I thought of the stare that we shared and the calm in her eyes. It was probably the last happy moment of her life. That peaceful, restful minute. I wanted to stay in that memory as long as I could, but I knew I had to get back to the present. I tried not to think, but for the moment, all my men could see was the river. All they could taste was blood. The guides informed us that the Incas were about 5 miles away, which meant we had to cross the river. It also meant that we had to build rafts. It would probably take a day or more, but we had no other option. In the hard heat, we took out our axes and chopped the tallest, thinnest trees we could find. The men worked fast, and by morning's end, they managed to cut 24 trees. Though it did seem we were progressing at a good rate, I knew we would have to wait until the next morning. We had already missed the tide. I hardly spoke to the men. I merely gave them orders. They didn't attempt to speak to me either, and I was grateful for that. The heat only got worse at midday, but it did not deter us from our focus. We needed to finish these rafts, and we worked and raced until sunset. We took off all our armor and worked in our rags. Mosquitoes bit at our faces and made their way down to our boots. Throughout the day, I heard a constant ticking sound that I thought came from a bird. I lost track of it from time to time, but the ticking sound remained, and it proved to be a useful cadence when the silence and the sounds of hacks and grunts were too much to bear. By then, our faces were red and smeared with dirt and sweat. Our concentration was tested, as was our exhaustion, but we managed to cut 10 more trees. When the planks were ready, we measured them and set them across. We stripped the wood with our swords and bounded rope made from strips of wreath and palm branches. Then we wrapped the planks together with rope. At the end of the day, we managed to construct 3 small sailing rafts, which could fit 5 men apiece. We tested all the rafts, and to our incredulity, they all worked. They were crude and laughably assembled, but they worked, and that's all that mattered. At night, we made a grand fire and slept until the next morning. I dreamt of nothing. I was too exhausted. At first light, I felt the river surge and the wind shift, and I could tell that a storm was soon approaching. In the morning, we drew straws. The 5 men with the shortest straws were left to go about on foot. There was simply no room. I ordered those men to catch up with us and go 5 miles north. The 5 dejected men took their orders, and as I saw the glum look on their faces, I knew for sure that I would never see them again. We took to the rafts, huddled together, and we set our course aloft. At the height of the tide, we sailed forward. I manned the center raft, and the other 2 rafts acted as wings. We used sticks of bamboo and rowed our rafts closer to one another. At first, it was rather difficult to steer, but the longer we sailed, the more comfortable I became. All three of the rafts floated as if one unit. But as the tide arrived, the river accelerated. The speed pleased the men very much, and they stared up at the tall trees of the land ahead. Our pace, however, slowed down considerably during the afternoon. We traveled rather far, and I felt content, though I knew deep down it was a moot point. I was still concerned that the men left on shore wouldn't keep up. We simply went too far and sailed too fast. We gradually slowed down as another hour passed. Then the current stopped, and the wind suddenly died. The sails caught no drift, and all the rafts had stopped completely. And for 2 hours, we were caught in the river's stillness. A steady stream of mosquitoes bit at our faces. We swatted and scratched our arms. Our skin peeled off, and our welts only got larger. I was pulled into a heavy trance. Then the wind switched, and the river became alive again. We took no hesitation and immediately adjusted our sails. About 5 minutes later, the rafts were back to steady motion. We successfully pulled ourselves out of the doldrums, and the men cheered in excitement. But as time passed, it got harder and harder to steer. Not too long after, we came to a broad turn in the river. The wind was at our back, and the tide pushed us beyond a rapid, unforgiving pace. Soon I heard the commotion from the men on my raft, and the swears and cries from the others. We barked on like dogs, trying to stay within sight, but there was no way to slow down. So we kept barking at each other in a constant rhythm. But the river gave no mercy, and soon the rafts drifted far apart. I yelled at the men in the first raft not to drift too far, but of course, they did just that. As we took the turn, I lost sight of the first raft. I screamed again at the men to keep together, but the wind carried us further apart, and we could neither stop nor steer. We caught up to the first raft moments later, but we were too late. The raft had toppled over, and there were no men left on board. We searched the waves to see if there were any survivors, but there were none. As the river grew still again, I commanded the men to head for dry land. Within a half hour, the 2 surviving rafts landed on shore. There were only 10 men now, and the remaining hours of the afternoon were silent and solemn. We held a vigil for the 5 we had lost and spent the last hours of daylight collecting wood for the night's fire. The land looked all the same. I sent 2 of the youngest men to scout out the area north, and I ordered the rest of the men to stay close. The men looked scared and confused. They looked like lost puppies. And it was then that I realized that these men did not have minds of their own. They lived in the thought of the collective. They were sheep, and I was their shepherd. The entire afternoon we took to the trees and branches and waited for the other men to arrive, but they never did. I had 2 thoughts. The first thought was that the men had either died or had gotten themselves lost. The other thought was that the men had planned to make their way back to Cusco. Both might have been true, but there was no way of knowing for sure. At sunset, I consulted with Cespedes, one of my main captains. He advised that we wait out the night and then search for the men in the morning, and I agreed with his suggestion, so we waited. During the night, I remembered being terribly cold, and I blew into my hands. I felt great pain, and it seemed like every bone in my body was frozen. Then I dreamt. I traveled through canyons and deserts, and later swamplands and endless marshes. I heard a murmured prayer above a balcony. It was the Ave Maria, but all the words were wrong. And there I saw Soto, engaged in a mission of his own. His face was old, very old. I saw his palace back in Spain. It was left abandoned. And I saw him pray for war. My friend Soto was like all the rest, dead and buried, dead and forgotten. But from this distance he appeared alive. He hovered near the chessboard, then lit it asunder and threw it into the flames. As I got closer, I managed to get a better view of him. But Soto didn't say a word to me. We just looked at each other for what seemed like hours. His eyes were swollen, his hair gray and withered, his beard long and old. He grumbled something incoherent that I thought was a prayer, and his breath smelled like a rotten corpse. Then Soto's flesh melted away from him, and he became a skeleton. Spiders crawled and spiraled down his rib cage, and rats crawled up top his shoulders. And as he melted, he chased me down from the jungle to the valley, and I ran and ran with my heart pounding. And the dream continued. In the background, I heard the Incas praying loudly to their gods. I heard their drums bang and increase in speed. In seconds, I flew through canyons and deserts and through mountains and shores. But then I stopped and found myself in a horrible swamp. I could fly no longer. I marched down a stretch of muddy land that was surrounded by tall trees. Upon a raft, I steered and went down the waters. I saw blood and rivers, rivers and blood. And beneath the river, I saw all the buried, forgotten souls. I saw the dead gray faces of Juan Pizarro, Balboa, and Escobar. Then I saw the rest of the Pizarros and Almagros. Their bloodied hands bobbed up to the surface, and scorpions crawled out from their mouths. Then I heard a yell. In an instant, Soto leaped out from the river and landed on my raft. Then he raised his sword and swung at my chest, and my heart sliced open, and I watched it drop down, down onto the surging river. The dream ended, and I awoke in the pouring rain. I was back in the jungle. My skin was soaked. I was unable to blink for several minutes. But I was alive. I kept looking around as the rain kept falling. I stood up to check on the men. All were present. They were still asleep and snoring. My heart still pounded, and I tried to breathe through my mouth. I let the air out through my nose, and I gasped and clutched at my heart. Then I remembered why I was there. I remembered the reason I was in the jungle, suffering through all this hell. I was still on a mission. I was there to kill Manco and to find what he was hiding. We ate fish in the morning. We were still clueless about the other men, but then our focus changed. The men shouted with glee and approached me with a small Inca statue of a puma. Then they placed it in my hands. It was made entirely from gold. "We're close, sir," one of the men said. I didn't believe it at first, nor did any of the men. I stared at the statue for a very long time. I asked the man where he found it, and the man merely pointed into the jungle. I gave him a nod. Then I gathered up the men, turned to them, clenched my teeth, and with a booming shriek, I yelled out, "Santiago!" The men cheered and punched the air with their fists. Then I unhinged my sword, led the men onward, and we marched through the swamp in the pouring rain. It rained throughout the entire afternoon. It rained in spurts and poured and drenched. Then it drizzled and poured again. But no matter how much it rained, it did not deter us in the slightest. The men possessed a new spirit. I saw it in their eyes. That little statue was all they needed. Later that day, we found more statues scattered along a thicket of bushes. Each man wanted one for his own, and they fought each other and bickered like children. They passed the statues to me, and I examined them all. They were all of gold or silver, meticulously crafted and distinctly Inca, and the men were elated. We paced faster and faster. We hacked through thick, thorny bushes and passed through muddy creeks, and the men continued to shout and cry. "We found it! We finally found it! El Dorado exists after all!" For the moment, it did. For the moment, it all made sense. It was a familiar feeling, and every time it happened, the feeling of utter disbelief came with it. We raced, delighted and bewildered, and the men continued to scream. "El Dorado! It's here! It's here! El Dorado!" My hands trembled. I saw the river and smelled it. I heard it rush and swoosh, and I heard the Pelton rang pang off my helmet. As for the statues, I held them in my hand and traced my finger up and down. I held them hard, wanting to crush them to see if they would crumble. But no matter how much pressure I applied, I couldn't break them. They were solid and real. I stared at the statues' faces. They were all pumas with opened eyes and mouths. Later, we found the waterfall. It was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. It seemed holy and just, and the water flew and rushed. And when it fell, it gushed and came back to the surface. The ripples looked soft as silk, and the men pointed out further. Beyond the stream were even more Inca statues, and the men screamed with unbridled joy. Some of them prayed. Some of them jumped like children. But they all rushed over through the heavy rain. "I can't believe it! I just can't believe it! Finally! Thank you, God! Good God Almighty!" They screamed and swam. But as the rain intensified, I had lost sight of them. I screamed again and again, but everything became blurred, and the only sounds heard were the rushing water and the sounds of clanging armor. The sounds dissipated, and soon a queer silence came and took over. I was in knee-deep water, and I shouted for the men to answer my call. But none did. I looked all over. Then I felt an ungodly pain. I fell down and almost drowned. I saw that something had struck me square on my shoulder. My entire body felt like it was on fire. I screamed and shouted and yelled for mercy. I had been stabbed by a spear. The spear was lodged into my shoulder, and I saw the blood pour out from the hole. Though my armor took the brunt of the blow, the pain was excruciating, and I fainted in and out, and the rain kept falling. I rushed to dry land and laid and shivered. It took me a full minute to get back up on my feet, and then in came the fog. It rolled in thick and heavy and covered the entire land. There was nothing but swamp and water. I forged ahead. I swung my sword and screamed. I bled and clutched my arm. I screamed once more and heard my voice echo. "Cespedes! Rodrigo! Speak, man! Anyone!" I shouted again. Nothing but silence. I looked up and down, left, then right. But all was still gray. But then the silence stopped, and it was replaced with screams. Later, I heard footsteps. I still couldn't see a thing. I turned my head and heard some men scream again. But then I heard entirely different sounds. Sounds of smacks and grunts. Sounds of slashing spears and arrows. And the sounds of the Incas defending their land. And from there I knew exactly what was happening. It was a trap. We fell into it beautifully. We simply forgot about the Incas. We were too enraptured by the bait. Our men were caught in the heavy fog and swamp, with nowhere to retreat. And the Incas took full advantage. All was set up in good time, and when the Incas had got close enough, they ambushed us from all sides. I heard more men scream. I hobbled and swung my sword blindly through the fog. I squinted and searched for any semblance of anything, and I heard the Incas laugh and scream. But still I didn't see them. Then the silence returned. I headed further down. I tripped and fell on a body and crashed to the ground. I turned to see who it was. The body's spleens were cut out from under him, and its mouth was filled to the brim with blood. It was Cespedes. I got as far as 20 paces and saw more of the same. I found bodies everywhere. All of them were my men. I counted 6 men on the far turn. 50 paces later, I counted 2 more. I searched the bodies and tried to see if any man was wounded. There weren't. They were all dead and cold. Some had whole spears lodged into their heads. Some had limbs and stomachs completely removed. Some were decapitated, but all of them had been stripped of their armor. I screamed and cried. I continued to stagger. I didn't know whether the Incas were behind me or in front of me. I just knew they were close. I hurried and hobbled away. The spear in my shoulder remained. I stopped to catch my breath, and to my horror, I found myself without a sword. I was petrified. I felt sweat run down my entire body, and I searched my cloak again and again. But still, I couldn't find my sword. My mind raced to remember where I had it last. I probably had it when I examined the corpses. I probably had it then. I probably sat it down to check each man's pulse just for a second, just so I could free my hands momentarily. But whatever was the case, I didn't have it now, and there was no sword in sight. I couldn't breathe. All I had left was my armor and my tiny sack of gold. That's all. I had left my fortune in a chest near the camp. I had forgotten all about it. My heart kept pounding. All I wanted to do was scream, but I couldn't. I lost my voice. I stood in the silence. Then I covered my face with my hands and I cried. I cried more than I did in my entire life. I cried long and hard. I was alone. There seemed not a soul left. Then I fell to my knees and simply waited for the Incas to approach and kill me. I waited. I waited for hours. It might have been more, but they didn't come. I fell to my side and closed my eyes. The rain subsided. My thought was that by playing dead, I would have more than a chance of surviving, though I'd have to be very careful in doing so. I would have to find the exact time to escape. I was still wearing my armor, and I struggled to pull it off. It was quite a difficult task. The spear was still lodged into my flesh, and I couldn't take the piece off from the front. So I unhinged myself from the piece by crawling out of it as I lay on my side. The pain was ungodly, but I managed to get through by wedging the tip of the spear through the crevice of the shoulder, and in one motion the armor came off. My heart still pounded. My rags were bloodied and soaked in sweat. I didn't have enough energy to stand, so I crawled on my knees and I languished as far as I could. When I got far enough, I stopped, and in that instant, I knew for certain that I would die. I fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion, hoping I would die right then and there and not have to live on the next day. But of course, the next day came, and I was still alive. The fog had disappeared, and the sun returned, and I heard the sounds of the river and the waterfall. I got to my knees and looked around again. Then I saw a dozen Incas approach with spears in their hands. They were about 100 yards away. They took their time and staggered into view. They got closer and closer. I stared at them for what seemed like an eternity, and they stared right back. Then they rushed at me at a teeming pace. They held spears and were 20 paces away. I stared at one Inca in particular. If there was ever an angel of death, it would have been him. He was a young man. His eyes grew wider, as did the other Incas. His face was covered in paint and dirt. His body was bare and torn with scars. He led them on, and they sprinted and dashed. 10 paces away. 5. I dropped to the ground. A voice cried from afar. Then the Incas stopped. Then a tall Inca walked towards me. He held out his knife and aimed for my heart. It was Manco. My hand shook. I reached into my bag, pulled out a gemstone, and offered it to him. It was my last gesture, but I knew it wouldn't amount to anything. Manco took the gemstone from my hand, but he didn't look at it. Instead, he continued to look me straight in the eye. Then he tossed the gemstone to the other Incas, and he slowly drew his knife towards my chest. But then he smiled, and he dropped the knife to the ground. He reached over and grabbed the spear that was still lodged into my shoulder. In one motion, he removed the spear and threw it to the ground. A few seconds later, Manco bent over to my side and wrapped my wound with a trinket of cloth until it was secure. He continued to look at me, and while he shook his head, I saw his smile start to fade. His fellow Incas yelled and shouted at him, but Manco shouted back at them and ordered them away, and they obeyed his command. Then Manco got back to his feet. For a full minute, all we did was stare at one another in silence. But then, the minute ended, and Manco blinked and simply turned away. Then he walked and led his Incas back into the jungle. For the longest time, I stared at the Incas until they had completely vanished from my sight. And then they were gone, and I was alone again. For the entire night, I hadn't moved more than 100 paces. I kept asleep for the majority of the time, and when I awoke, I stared up at the stars. I couldn't go on. I didn't want to. Though alive and walking, my mind was flooded with guilt. The feeling in me was haunting and overwhelming. I felt empty and sad. Everything felt like borrowed time. and I knew for certain that this dream in Peru was over. My loyalties to Gonzalo were terminated by my own regard. I felt very much like a dead man, lost in between two worlds. The entire night I kept awake, and I was taken by the moment, so much so I could not think of anything else. And tears ran down my eyes. That moment, that baffling moment. It was a miracle of some sort. It wasn't much later that I understood it completely. It came to me when I remembered the time back in Cusco. That odd little moment. The moment where Menka was at my mercy, and I simply was unable to swing my sword. It wasn't until even later that I realized that the moment had simply repeated itself, with the roles reversed. Manko knew it at the time. I did not. Though some would say it was a mutual understanding, I knew in my heart that it was not. It was merely an exchange of the gift and the burden of living. Manko simply returned the favor. The next morning, I hobbled and followed the river west. There was nothing in sight for miles, and I felt a great peace. Though I felt dead, what kept me alive was the flow of the river. It provided me with new life and meaning, and I followed it every day. And many times it felt as if I were floating. I continued west. In my heart, I knew it was the right direction. I thought of God, and if I would see him again. And for days on end, I walked alone. In the back of my mind, I knew the Inca gods were stronger and more real than my own. My God was replaced by gold, simply because I couldn't trust him. I could only see glimpses of my God in dreams, but I could see the Inca gods every time I stared into the river. And each time, the feeling made me realize their beauty and power. And in time, the river meant more to me than anything else in the world. So I followed it until it met the shore. The river grew smaller. Days turned to weeks. In that time, I regained my strength and ate what the river provided. I ate fish and oysters. Each meal was good and filling, and I tried to pray. I was amazed that the mountains were still in sight, and I looked back whenever I could. I simply wanted to see its beauty. In my mind, I saw the Incas on top of the snow caps, and from that high elevation, I saw their trails of breath in the cold dawn. I imagined them praying to their ice god, and I saw them with their hands outstretched in reverence to welcome the rising sun. On the jagged slopes of the Andes, I imagined all the Incas gathered. I imagined their ceremonies, their continued celebrations of all life, their laughs and cries, and their smiles. It wasn't until then that I understood it. I understood its beauty, and I confirmed it with a sigh and a nod. Another morning came. I continued to stare and wonder. And so, too, I imagined Manco. I imagined him there on the mountain with his son by his side. And in that final glance up the mountains, I had imagined I heard them chant a long and lingering song that returned to me in echoes. It was then that I knew in my heart that the Incas would never be conquered. They would fight in different ways, but they, as people, would remain forever. A cold morning drizzle settled, the winds grew and whipped. The more I moved west, the less and less I saw of the mountains. But forever in my mind, I thought about them. And in the quiet moments that lingered, I still could hear the sound of whistling. And finally, a few hours later, I saw the ocean, and I knew I had left the jungle for certain. And I found something lodged into the sand. It was a heavy metal object that was rusted and seemed as if it weren't touched in years. It was a sword. I stared at it for a long time. I picked it up and knew that other Spanish men were near. I wondered whose sword it was, but the thought escaped me, as did its trance. I didn't want to give more time than it deserved, so I plunged the sword back to the sand, moved past it, and met the ocean. A day later, I found men near the shore. The men were very poor and looked defeated. In the time I spent on shore, I learned that the men had been searching for El Dorado and had given up. Some men had been with Almagro. Others were merely mercenaries who abandoned Cusco. They all shared the same look of dejection and disgust, and all they talked about were their plans to go back to Mexico or Spain. And in 2 days, they got their wish. A ship arrived on shore, heading north. The men on the ship said they would take anyone who wanted to pay the fare. And after a brief minute of thought, I had made my decision. I stared at my bag that contained my fortune. It was merely a handful, about 50 pieces of gold and 30 pieces of silver. The rest I had lost in the fog. That was my fortune, my tiny fortune. It would be even less when I boarded the ship. It was a ragged old ship, and it looked exactly like the ship I refused to board when Francisco made his line in the sand. But I felt at ease, only temporarily. I didn't recall the men on board, nor any conversations. I left them alone, and they did the same for me. I just remember the smells of salt and sea, and my body rocking back and forth. I was alone with my thoughts again, and I spent my time in wonder. I wondered about Francisco, and I imagined him in his palace in Lima. I pictured him leaning over a veranda, watching sunset after sunset with tired, drunken eyes. Did he smile when he did so? Yes, he most likely did. Then I thought of Soto and his voyage back to Spain. He was the richest man in the world, and he knew it. Though knowing Soto, he probably grew tired of smiling. Finally, I thought of Manco and the lineage of Inca kings, and the beauty of their people and their land that I had failed to see all this time. Afterwards, my thoughts died. All I did next was stare at the sea. I was still alive. I should have died. I should have died many times. But there I was. I still could move my hands. I still could see and touch and feel. I was alive. No other thoughts mattered. And it was all very hard to believe. I kept the lie intact. I looked Coronado straight in the eyes. I said what I knew would work. We didn't find him. We didn't find Manco Inca. That's all there is to tell, Coronado. There was only a shred of truth to what I said, but Coronado accepted it fully and nodded in respect. He was bewildered, and he looked a bit sad when I finished my tale. I was as well. So you made it all the way here, Sardina? Yes. Did that ship bring you all the way up here? No. There were other ships. 3 more. I boarded all the ones I could afford. No one knew who you were? No. No one asked? No man knew me. They didn't ask, so I didn't tell them. Coronado uncrossed his legs. Then he reached for the jug of wine. It was empty. He tipped the bottle and tried to drink the last sips, but there wasn't even a drop. Then he stared at me with a baffled face. So here you are, Sardina. I am. I, for one, am very glad. So, Sardina, do you miss it? Miss what? Do you miss the chaos? I didn't respond. I merely gave him a glance and waited for a full minute. Did I miss it? Did I miss the chaos? Why did I tell this story to Coronado in the first place? Was I just passing the time? Was I just whetting his appetite? To feed the hungry, as many would say? I wasn't sure. I don't think I'll ever be. I studied my hand, then I studied my fingers. I moved them and watched them grasp the air. They were still dirty. They still smelled of blood. Do you miss it, Sardina? Coronado laughed. Then he turned to me again, and I gave him the most honest answer I could think of. I can't tell.